is it safe to handle 2.5, $2.4 quadrillion of transactions every year? Someone has to govern that decision. It can't be up to the individual ledger itself. So that framework is DTCC's responsibility, and we embrace it.
Welcome to High Stakes, the podcast committed to demystifying the institutional adoption of blockchain technology. I'm your host, Alex Nwaka, and today we're elevating the Web3 discourse in a series of conversations with industry iconoclasts that are shaping the future of Web3. Now let's get started. Welcome back to another episode of High Stakes. I'm your host, Alex Nwaka, and today I am joined by none other than Dan Doney, who is the Managing Director and CTO at DTCC Digital Assets. Welcome to High Stakes, Dan.
Alex, it's good to be here, and I feel like you're scooping a bit here because it's been a while since we've been hard at work inside DTCC, and it's been a while since I've given interviews. So
awesome. Well, really happy to have you. Dan, you have a very, what I would say, interesting and far-reaching background, including the U.S. Navy, Defense Intelligence Agency, founder of Securrency, and now you're at DTCC. Definitely want to spend some time, diving a little bit into your background and, how some of these roles shaped sort of your career and sort of your role today. So maybe what we can start with is I wanted to prompt you first on DTCC because I feel like most people, it's like the largest company I feel like most people have never heard of. 2.5 quadrillion of dollars transacted last year. That's like a huge number. For most people, they don't know, what exponential that even is to, but maybe just give a quick overview in your own words of DTCC, what the organization does, and maybe just give people a quick primer on it.
Yeah, so DTCC has been around for over 50 years, founded in the 1970s. It was designed to solve the problem of fragmentation in U.S. capital markets, where there were many transfer agents, records were kept on paper certificates, there were electronic systems, but actually getting all systems to agree fundamentally on who owned what, who owned shares of IBM. As the markets accelerated, they were falling farther and farther behind, and the financial systems, financial market participants were falling farther and farther behind in their ability to keep up. So DTCC was formed to be a single touch point. So instead of having to interact with a whole bunch of individual transfer agents and their systems, you could really interact with one party. And that allowed the financial markets it really restructured the financial markets in such a way that they've lasted up until today. At the time, I think it was T+7 for settlement times, and then 5, and then 3, and 2, and most recently, this past year, DTCC led the financial markets as the core model for consensus to T+1s. What that means is that when you conduct transactions, a trade of shares of your favorite equity, the official record and the total transaction is complete on all systems. All parties agree as to what ownership is 1 day later, T+1, trade time plus 1 day. Well, that model and that responsibility of a couple other simple things about DTCC. We are a private company owned by the financial market institutions. So all the big players have a stake in DTCC. So in many ways, you could say that we're the DAO for the U.S. financial markets in that we're owned by those parties. We are perhaps arguably the most important SIPMU, systemically important financial market utility, basically the infrastructure on which all other institutions conduct their trades. And the expectation is enormous. You have to be up all the time. So it's a very conservative organization focused on managing risk and making sure the lights are always on for financial markets. That's a huge responsibility. And the transaction volumes in the 2+ quadrillion, I think it's actually even higher than 3 quadrillion as transactions have accelerated. It is a huge responsibility. There's no one else even close in terms of transaction volume processed anywhere in the world. So it is really cool coming from being acquired from a blockchain world into this institution. Again, if you think about it, we are the consensus model for the US market. So the way that all parties in the system come to agree on ground truth is our job. What's interesting is there's a technology that emerged in 2008 whose probable the principal value proposition is the ability to form consensus at global scale amongst untrusted parties. Well, that's either like an amazingly disruptive thing to what we do, or an enormous opportunity to improve and accelerate what we do. We, of course, see it as the latter. But look, if parties don't move quickly, and we know this, then it is, in fact, a disruptive technology that other parties will harness to eliminate the need for an organization like us to form consensus. But here's why I'm convinced that will never happen. It will either be DTCC or a body like DTCC, because, in fact, these financial transactions, imagine I've got 1 or 100 distributed ledgers. As we see, they're proliferating, actually, the number of layer 1s and layer 2s that are out there. That means there's more than one ledger. And you're actually we're entering into the very world that was 1971 before DTCC was formed, and that there are all these different systems of record that ultimately, if I'm going to, for example, pay a dividend distribution to the parties who own the share at 12:01 p.m. on March the 1st, I have to know all of the records, all of the distributed ledgers, and have a single position reconciled across all of those distributed ledgers to affect that outcome. So you see, in the end, you're back to the same game, that you need a mechanism that ties this together. And we see that as our responsibility, is a mechanism to, you'll see as we dig into this a bit more, forming a global tokenization layer, a mechanism that allows you to tokenize DTC holdings, any of DTC eligible assets, which is everything. Right? It's virtually everything that you trade that has value is we're the principal record keeper. So we are looking to make all of that available in token form, so parties can trade their traditional positions to tokenized form and back again to traditional positions, which will radically open financial markets and particularly radically change the liquidity on blockchain rails, which is really a separate pool from traditional market liquidity. So we're excited about bringing these markets together. It is ultimately our responsibility, but what qualifies Ledger 1 versus Ledger 2 to participate in this framework, or Ledger 3, or some great new distributed ledger, the next generation that comes along? Is it safe to handle 2.5, 2.4 quadrillion dollars of transactions every year? Someone has to govern that decision. It can't be up to the individual ledger itself. So that framework is DTCC's responsibility, and we embrace it.
And I think it's, you're making a point that we can get to later on, single chain versus multi-chain world. I think you're just making the case that it's obvious that it's a multi-chain world as you see it for what you all do. Dan, I do want to pivot back because I think, one of the best parts about High Stakes is that we actually try to profile people that just have a really interesting set of experiences that got them into this space. And I feel that most people, may not know your background, and it's taken a lot of different, sort of forms. And so I sort of want to go back because I think the coolest thing that I've heard about your background is sort of your Navy experience. I mean, it's kind of fascinating. You began your career as a nuclear submarine officer in the U.S. Navy for over a decade. I have to imagine that's a unique experience that not a lot of people have. Sort of curious, any memorable sort of like experiences or things that you want to talk about there that you can talk about for that matter that have sort of shaped who you are and sort of how you came into sort of this technology space?
There's a lot that I can't talk about, of course. That I don't mean to cop out on this. In that time, I was definitely in some interesting places doing some very interesting things. The experience really did shape me in a way that I think is fascinating. As a junior officer, so you are 22, 23 years old, you are put in charge of, so you are the officer of the deck. So for a period of time, every watch, which is a 6-hour period of time, every time you come on watch, where you are what's known as the officer of the deck, you have command authority over the operation of that, in this case, submarine. Now there's a captain, but if you're on watch overnight, captain is sleeping and you must make the decisions. So you're a young person with a $4 billion device that you're operating, and more than 100 people's lives, depending on the decisions that you make. And you make those decisions with uncertainty. So it's not like what people see on the movies, where when you're driving the submarine, you're looking at some green screen and it's got a dot on it where all the bad guys are. It's actually, you don't actively ping things and see them. Otherwise, everyone in the ocean would know where you are. You're listening. And what that means is the best you have is effectively mathematical traces that you need to do math to figure out what things are close or not close. Think about it. If you can only hear in one direction, you don't know if that's far away or not. If you hear something, it's out there, it's in that direction, but you have no sense for how far until you maneuver. And then you can actually figure out by the rate of change that how far away they are. Anyways, it's a complex thing. What you do there is every time you come to the surface, another thing that people don't realize is sailboats don't make noise, so you don't hear them. You go through this big risk period where there's a chance that you may collide with that thing if your math is wrong. And again, you've got to make that decision really every night when you're on watch. And again, people's lives are at stake, not just yours, but the other boats that you might run into, et cetera. What you learn in that experience, what you must do is make decisions with less than perfect information. And in terms of a differentiator in my career, and this is true of many folks who've been put in those kinds of situations, in athletes sometimes are put in that position. So there's a number of folks who have this experience. They really do have an advantage because so oftentimes I've seen in other settings, people were paralyzed by decision-making when there's less than perfect information. So I feel grateful. The military was great to me. Those experiences, I'm fond of people I served with during that time. And it did, in fact, shape me.
So one thing to follow that, so you did spend some time afterwards as the first Chief Innovation Officer at the Defense Intelligence Agency. I have two questions here. So one is, I think for the audience who may not know what the Defense Intelligence Agency even does, maybe just like a very short primer on that. But I think what I'm most interested in, I'm always curious when an organization creates a role for the first time. What are they trying to accomplish with this role? What's the mandate of that role? Why was the person selected? Or why was the role created for them? So what's the Defense Intelligence Agency? Just very quick snippet. But then I'm most curious about why this role created, what was the mandate, and how you found it.
But most people know of the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency and the FBI. These are three-letter agencies. Well, DIA is another one of the three-letter intelligence agencies. There are a handful of them, and each serves a different mission, intelligence mission. Specifically, the Defense Intelligence Agency's responsibility is to the warfighter, to get the warfighter the best information in order to prosecute their tasks, the best intelligence to prosecute their mission. It's different than Central Intelligence Agency, which is really designed to inform the president and the national security staff so that they make the best decisions. So they're really focusing up, and DIA is focused out. Fascinating mission, all kinds of really cool stuff that they do that most people don't know about. Their name does come up in a couple of movies here and there, but mostly, of course, people know CIA, etc. I was asked to perform that role. I spent, post-Navy, I spent the bulk of my career at the National Security Agency in advanced research, working mostly on AI, but touched quantum, among other things. This is way earlier than people even knew that quantum was a thing in the early 2000s. Established myself there, and with some later work at the Department of Homeland Security, where I had a pretty good reputation as an innovator, and was asked to come on to the Defense Intelligence Agency in the role. They formed the role for this purpose. What really it should be seen was, at first, there was an understanding about what an chief innovation officer would do. People were thinking I'd come in and do innovative things. And it became clear to me right away, it wasn't that the agency lacked good ideas. They didn't have efficient mechanisms, being a conservative organization, to convert good ideas into action and mission outcomes. And they didn't have good processes to bring good ideas that emerged elsewhere, Silicon Valley, et cetera, into mission settings. Now, there are brilliant folks in DIA and other intelligence organizations, but they're insular given the nature of their mission. So they do brilliant things that would surprise people, but also the world is moving fast. And there's Joy's law is Bill Joy, founder of Sun Microsystems, basically had a law, I'm paraphrasing, that no matter how many smart people are inside your organization, there's always more smart people outside. So by extension, what makes an entity innovative is the ability to harness those ideas, bring them to mission outcomes. Well, that's very relevant to where I am today. Financial institutions, by their very nature and their responsibilities, are very conservative, risk averse. And that makes them insular in many ways in terms of the way they operate by necessity. But the world is moving fast, and there are great technologies out there that can fundamentally transform the way they do business. And the work that I did to make that possible at the DIA is actually very relevant to what I'm doing at DTCC. So it's pretty funny how things come full circle.
No, absolutely. And you started Securrency, at least to my knowledge, right after that. And, just for folks to get an idea, this is 2015. Ethereum's maybe just becoming a thing. kind of. You're starting Securrency with this sort of concept of, regulated tokenization, settlement, digital assets, talking about things like Web3 and real world assets, RWAs. In 2015, I would say 10 years before, I would say it's even in the zeitgeist, so to speak. What was in your head then? What were you thinking about? What did you see 10 years before sort of what I would call the broader public or market as it related to the technology?
It's funny. I saw exactly what now people are coming to realize is the centerpiece of today. So just to roll back a little bit, in my Chief Innovation Officer job, looking at if technologies coming down the pike, blockchain was one of those technologies that we were observing. And I remember going to a conference at the Aspen Institute, and there was a zealot there, and he sent me some Bitcoin on a wallet. He said, "Hey, download this wallet, and I'll send you some Bitcoin, and you'll see how cool this is." And it was. It was like, wow, this is game. It was so easy for me to get this. He could send me value. I could send it on to other people. This is so much easier than traditional finance. But I returned to my job, and we're tracking activity that's occurring there, and it was clear straight away that you could follow the trails to see weapons trafficking, human trafficking, drug trafficking, and so a powerful technology which could be used for good, but also could be used for bad things that had to be regulated. You can't just say, well, there's some human trafficking. Well, what are we going to do? As responsible citizenry should be doing something about that. And that's where regulations ultimately come from. Well, part of what got me the job at DIA was some work that I had done in identity proofing and citizen-facing government, and how people could actually engage with the government to understand their government-held privacy data. But that required you to proof an individual, because you shouldn't be able to check my information. I shouldn't be able to check yours. Anyway, it was the early days of that. And it became clear to me, if we take this great technology blockchain and layer identity capabilities over top of blockchain, you could have a much better, much more efficient financial system, one that was much more accessible to anyone globally. With that in mind, I built the first system in 2015 to tokenize commercial real estate leases and actually securitize them and produce dividend-paying instruments. And I showed you could do the same thing with mortgages and the same thing with leases. And I was like, wow, this is pretty cool. I could do the things that major financial institutions have massive systems for. I could do very quickly and efficiently here. So I quit my day job, as cool as it was, and founded the company. As we began to want to take these things to market and let people buy into these assets, we hired a lawyer. He said, "Hey, you realize that these are securities, that they're income producing, passive income. These are securities for sure. Of course, they're securities." We formed the company Securrency. The name of the company that I founded was the blending of securities and currencies into a new financial instrument that was easy as cash to transfer, but that had the benefit, the investment thesis of securities. So as easy as it was to build a tokenization platform, I thought, well, what? Well, these are clearly securities. They're governed. Why don't we just automate the compliance aspects of these? We'll just build that into the tokens themselves. It took me 6 months to build a tokenization, actually 3 months to build a tokenization platform. Why can't I do that in 6 months? Well, that was crazy. That was way wrong. It took way longer than that to actually wrangle blockchain systems into a way that made them suitable for regulated assets. And that became our calling card in the industry. So what really set us apart, when there was a bunch of nonsense then, and still now, that occurred on those blockchain rails, people speculating on value being taken advantage of, great deal of value being stolen. You needed to have the kinds of mechanisms that allowed mom and pop to be able to engage with these technologies safely without being a smart contract auditor. That involved a whole lot of work, and again, set us up perfectly for this time now, where everyone realizes, as big as the blockchain world is, the crypto world is, it's tiny compared to the rest of finance. And what we want is the efficiency that offers, that you get from the crypto world, for the rest of finance. Why? Because that makes finance much more accessible, much more fair, much more efficient for everyone. And that's what I'm here to do now that I'm part of the center of finance. I'm in an organization where it's all going down. And if you were to take and convert it all, to change it all, there's no better place than the organization that I'm in. That's why I'm not doing many interviews, because we're hard at work in retooling the core to make that possible.
Well, let's go there next then, Dan. So, Securrency was acquired by DTCC. You've taken on this role now as the managing director and CTO of DTCC Digital Assets. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about, hey, here's the mandate within this division within DTCC, and you can use that as a jumping off point to talk a little bit about some of the work you guys are sort of heads down, hard to work on, whether that's specific products or specific initiatives. So I'll sort of give you the floor because I know you guys are up to some really interesting stuff.
The CEO, Frank LaSala, and the board had foresight that, hey, this is a disruptive technology that can fundamentally change the way we do business. We need to harness that technology. So they acquired Securrency not as the only technology, but as a foundation, especially a foundation for how you do regulated assets on which we could blend together the other technologies, distributed ledgers, smart contract frameworks, tokenization frameworks, to create a coherent marketplace. So they were forward leaning in that model. As I mentioned to you, the one right to win that DTCC has in this model is we are the record keeper for quadrillions of dollars of transactions, but for fundamentally assets under record, approximately $100 trillion worth of assets. So unilaterally, without the need to engage anyone else, we can actually make it possible to tokenize $100 trillion worth of value. No one else can do that efficiently. So we have both a right and a responsibility to do that effectively for the financial markets, because it unlocks so much among those things that it unlocks. So we're building out those rails to do that, to make it so that parties can, within seconds, convert any traditional holding into token form to conduct transactions. But tokens themselves really aren't game changers. They're just another database, a database with benefits to be sure, but just another database in the end. It's actually what you can do with tokens that makes the big difference. And the foundational transaction in finance is collateral. So most people think liquidity really comes from trading activity, that's what makes a difference, my ability to convert dollars to shares of Tesla. Yeah, that's important. But by far, that's a drop in the bucket compared to transactions in liquidity that have to do with borrowing and lending. So there are transactions, repurchase agreements are the way that banks get liquidity. So they take assets, high quality assets like treasuries, and when they need cash, they post them as collateral and borrow cash from one another in a model called repurchase agreements or repos. That transaction is the most dominant transaction of any globally on a daily basis. Over $20 trillion a day. I think it's even more than that. But anyway, roughly that amount is in that transaction. Well, it turns out blockchain is the perfect technology. Perfect. It's like tailor-made. It's the killer app for blockchain to do collateral management. Why? Because you can encode the locking rules into smart contracts. Now, if it were just that simple to make a smart contract that locks something up while another transaction takes place till it completes, then Aave and Compound and other DeFi lending, done. We're already there. Well, it's more than that. There are additional transactions that are required for how do I swap out my collateral? How do I properly price and haircut and so on? So there's a lot more than just that basic, what you see in DeFi. However, all of it can be automated in smart contracts. And now transactions that take certainly hours, sometimes days for financial institutions to do. And here's another example. When Lehman Brothers failed in 2008, all of the value that was caught up in these collateral agreements and other encumbrances, it took 14 years from that bankruptcy to actually unwind all of those positions. In an institutional DeFi world, that's about 14 seconds before all those positions unwind. So it's radically different, much more efficient. What this means to banks, they're having to pre-position their collateral in various places. So they're taking a bunch of their balance sheet, they're locking it up, and that has to be locked up in advance of these collateral transactions because of the time that it takes for the value to move. on legacy rails. That means the banks can't efficiently use their capital for the things that they're meant to do, which is their own lending operations, their own trading operations. And it's that lack of efficiency or that drag in the financial systems that has enormous cost, like on the order of hundreds of millions of dollars or more per day to the world. That can be fixed in a relatively straightforward way with a sophisticated smart contract framework. Well, that's the perfect killer app for all these newly tokenized securities in the space: treasuries, cash, other securities funds, money market funds, etc. Being able to use them in collateral and lending, repo transactions, securities lending transactions, margin transactions that settle in seconds. That's ultimately what will unlock the tipping point. And you're seeing it. We are very close to that point in the markets now, because there's so much demand. Inbound, we're hearing from everyone. People are gunning for these solutions at this point. And so it's an exciting time. There's not much time left for people who don't embrace this new technology, this new method, because everyone's at it now. And when everyone's at it and you address these core liquidity functions in the market, you'll be left behind if you're not able to keep pace.
So, you're talking a little bit about market adoption. So I'll just ask the question, I'm not sure if you're a baseball fan, but, what inning in the baseball game do you feel like we're in right now when you start to talk about like broad scale adoption? Are we in like the seventh inning? Are we in, the first inning? What's your sense?
Well, my baseball career ended in Little League, so not exactly a pro by any stretch. I think we're past the seventh inning stretch at this point. That was probably the last winter. It's now the bottom of the seventh, or maybe the eighth inning here as we're rounding the corner. It's very close to the finish. So you better have your best reliever lined up and it's really moving fast. I'll tell you, from an institutional setting, I mean, we are very, very close now to markets being wide open.
What would you, if you were talking to some of the big, I'll call it vertically integrated asset managers, right? So I'm thinking about like BlackRock, I'm thinking about, sort of the big folks. Like if you had to give them, sort of like what they should be thinking about if they're not already thinking about it, what would be that sort of advice that you'd give to sort of the upper echelons of those organizations?
That's a good question. So as you know, BlackRock's already in this game, and many others are. This one word of caution is compliance still does matter. Mm-hmm. So some folks are actually taking the recent mandate and change of administration as like a free pass. All right, it's on, let's roll. Slow down, folks. We've seen this in a series of cycles, and you can't say, well, it works for, I won't name any institute, but it works for them. So, and we trust them, so it's good. If the principle doesn't apply, you can't stop some little Ponzi scheme person from following that same principle and then breaking the rules. And as soon as you do that, as soon as you allow bad apples, they spoil the batch. So I do think that folks do have to remember the importance of programmable compliance and the importance of making sure you cannot have unregulated, uncontrolled assets. You can't. That will lead to bad outcomes. And I think folks are skirting that now just because they've seen some examples. Just like we said in 2015, regulations do matter. They can't just stand idly by. The bigger this gets, the more important it will be. It will matter that folks do this the right way. And I think there's some exuberance, a little bit too much, that let's just move fast. And so I would caution against that. On the other hand, I do think, or in addition to that thought, for leaders, we're now talking about core financial transactions, like institutional DeFi, truly in its deepest form, and the opportunity to fundamentally, radically change the cost points for back and middle office operations and to enhance customer value is extraordinary. You've got to be aware of the strengths and weaknesses of this technology because it's moving fast.
So one of the things we touched on earlier, Dan, was, at the scale at which DTCC operates, and frankly, the traditional financial markets operate, there are, some limitations that you start to bump up against when you start to talk about, a single blockchain block space. And I think what you were sort of saying or going down the path of is that, we are going to be living in a multi-chain world. I think there's a variety of different components to that, but do you want to sort of unpack that a little bit more? And then I'm also kind of curious in the same vein about public versus private blockchains, because this is often discussed, right, in sort of the more regulated or more risk averse, sort of organizations of whether to be on sort of a private blockchain exclusively, or what are the risks of being on a public blockchain. So I know it's a big topic, but I'm just curious how you would frame that for the audience.
For everyone's aware, there won't be one blockchain. There can't be one blockchain. No matter how passionate you are about your favorite layer one, there can't be one. If there's only one, then there will be no innovation, because there's no break-in point. The barrier of entry is too high. And basically you'll have the malaise that you have in traditional financial systems, just you'll have it in blockchain form. So there'll be many, and they'll continue to proliferate in this world. The real question, and the other truth is, you cannot scale a decentralized blockchain, theoretically impossible, that maintains each of the three balance points for a blockchain to 1 million transactions per second, really the amount that we would need to cover global scale financial transactions. You can't do it. So there can't be one. What that means is methods to connect chains together and to actually have a chain of chains is actually the essential component in this new world. And there's good solutions out there in order to connect chains. So I can have one blockchain that is completely public. I can stand up another blockchain, a layer 2 blockchain. I can proof its activity down to the lower chain. And now I've just doubled the scale of that chain. I can do that a layer above and a layer above, or layers outward, horizontally or vertically, to get to that point. But what that means is I have many chains. Now, those chains may be public. They may be private. There are good reasons why chains should be private. Transaction privacy matters. Let's say I want to run a dark pool. That's a useful thing in the markets. And so you do want to keep your transactions private. You don't want people to front run every time you move this far of value. It means you're about to do that trade. So there is a need for transaction privacy in the end. And that's a form of multiple chains, at the very least, if it's not multiple chains. So we're working on that, on specifically hyperscale. We want a ledger of ledger methodology that allows us to get to 1 million transactions per second. We're looking to demonstrate this to the world sometime over the next year. We think it's necessary, and it's also quite possible. We're working on app chains. So effectively, a app chain that DTCC is what's known as a CSD, a Central Securities Depository. There's only one in the US. In other jurisdictions, there are multiple CSDs. We're working on a CSD app chain that is basically collateral management, margin accounts, clearing operations, et cetera, all automated through smart contracts. And you move the value from your favorite chain or your favorite traditional ledger to the app chain, conduct those transactions, and move it back. That's a radical new way to address core CSD operations, core securities operations.
Fantastic. So Dan, I had 2 more questions for you. One is, related to, I'm assuming that at some point, just given all the different technologies that you've touched through your career, that you've stumbled across AI. Obviously, this is like one of the hottest areas globally right now. How do you see AI and blockchain intersecting as technologies? And is there anything inside of DTCC, either from an initiative standpoint or just a thinking standpoint, that would combine those two concepts? So more of a general question on, do you see them converging? And then maybe more specifically within DTCC, is there some sort of thought process of how those technologies could be leveraged together?
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier in my career, I did a lot of work in AI. And the hardest problem was always getting clean data. Some of deep learning and generative AI has assisted in that problem, to be sure, but it still remains an important aspect of machine learning in general, clean data. Well, you can't get a cleaner, purer source than what you get from blockchain ledgers, where you can actually observe and get to consensus truth across a global scale, both in data and ownership. It produces a very clean set of inputs to AI. So I think there's a very clear nexus between what you do on blockchain and what you do in the AI world. The opposite is also true. So this near term is something that we're working with a number of parties. And that is, a lot of the rules and a lot of the agreements, contracts between parties exist in prose form. Inside of those documents are very specific enforceable rules. And what you'd like to be able to do is extract that content into basically machine readable code, and then through smart contracts, automatically execute the terms of those agreements in a way that's deterministic. Now, I don't think we're far enough along with hallucinations and other things to be able to trust the machine to go all the way end to end. But when that information is extracted in a way that could be human verified as it's encoded into the smart contracts to then execute, for example, a mortgage or a real estate lease through its life cycle, that's powerful. So here we have AI being the means to create the deterministic rules, and then blockchain smart contracts being the way to execute those rules. That's going to be a powerful combo over the next couple of years, really transform a lot of the pain that banks experience in having to have legal teams interpret every time a trade fails.
Got it. So the question we ask every one of our guests, Dan, is what's your hot take, bold prediction for the current year in sort of the digital asset and Web3 space? So what's your hot take?
I'm going to skip out on the current year. I think that in 2026, you're going to see public exchanges for tokenized securities, crypto, cash, etc. So I think you're going to see regulated DEX operating in 2026 timeframe. Then that's going to unlock a whole lot of the rest of what we all expect. That will truly close the gap between DeFi and institutional DeFi.
Awesome. Dan, thank you so much for coming on High Stakes. We really appreciated, some of your answers and hearing what's going on inside of DTCC. Look forward to having you on again soon.
Yeah, Alex, I love it. Thanks. Happy to come back. But
thanks a lot, Dan.
Keep exploring and keep innovating. Learn more at validationcloud.io and follow us on X and LinkedIn to stay connected as we continue to shape Web3 for institutions. This is High Stakes with Alex Nwaka, signing off.